Hi everyone, Stuart MacGregor, partner in the Energy and Resources team here at Clayton Utz. I'd like to introduce Susan Taylor, who is a partner who's recently joined our Melbourne office and is an energy regulatory specialist. Today we're going to be talking about a bit of the background in relation to the national electricity market, which Susan and I found hard to believe is actually 27 years old currently. So we're going to be looking at the background of the NEM and how things are changing in relation to our moving towards net zero at quite a rapid pace. So now, Susan, I understand you worked on the development of the very first set of market rules for the NEM.
I hate to admit it because it was 27 years ago, but here is the very first version of what was then called the National Electricity Code, October 1996, can you believe it? And it was one of the best projects I've ever worked on in my career. We were engaged by the National Grid Management Council, and I had the privilege of working with these amazingly talented electrical engineers from all around Australia. They were all working for the state-owned utility companies at the time, those behemoths that have now been accused of gold-plating the network. And they helped to teach me all the technical aspects of the national electricity market, everything from how power is generated, how it was conveyed along transmission lines, to metering and how it was delivered to customers. And it was an amazing experience because I got this technical background, and for a lawyer that's quite helpful. At the same time, I taught those people how to draft, and I would get versions of the National Electricity Code, pieces of it sent to me, and my job was to make it into user-friendly language that could be understood by everyone. I suppose there's a lot of people who would agree that we didn't quite hit that objective, but it was, I think we, in the time we had, which was about 18 months, the product that we produced wasn't too bad, and it was certainly enough to start the market off back in 1996. And one of the things I love about the national electricity market, right from that time up until today, it's always been amenable to adjustments, major adjustments, new rules such as the introduction of the market network service provider concept and tweaks. So everyone's always been amenable to that, and without undermining investment confidence, it has been an evolution ever since that time, and I think we're about to see it go through an evolution again.
No, I think that's a really good point. The 27 years, it's stood the test of time, but what we're going through at the moment is sort of unlike anything we've seen in the last 27 years. So the last few years there's been an acceleration, obviously, again, the move towards net zero. But not just that, we've also seen some really interesting technology coming out as well. And I know AEMO has been putting out, sort of December, they put out a publication on the roadmap to 100% renewables, but that new technology's sort of got a real basis around, be it inverters and inertia and batteries, and how all those things fit in with something that was drafted in 1996, which was not really before anyone had thought of an inertia or thought of inverters and battery storage at this level of capacity. It was just sort of a pipe dream. So I'd be interested to hear how things have changed with the NEM, and also with the Energy Security Board, what they're doing as far as looking at the system and the NEM system security, other things like that, as to how it can go forward.
Yes, I mean, I was just flicking through this earlier just to have a look, and back then we had coal-fired generation which was running all the time, the base load power plants, and only when the price was high or when demand was high would we need to turn on the gas-fired generation. Only in extraordinary circumstances would there be a price spike, and that was typically when a network failed for some reason. But that was really the only generation mix there was. And there was a quite simple dispatch algorithm in the rules, which the forerunner of AEMO developed and ran, and it would typically clear the market and balance supply and demand and set the price in every trading interval of every day. And it was designed to be what's called an energy-only market, which means that all the energy was cleared in every trading interval. And it contrasted to many markets overseas, which were capacity markets. And it's interesting to think about capacity markets, and this is where the Energy Security Board has started to think about this for the NEM. What we're talking about in electricity capacity markets is not like in the gas pipeline system, where capacity is referring to the amount of space in the gas pipelines and it can be traded. It's more about whether there's sufficient generation to cover demand at any one particular time. And this is where I think the Energy Security Board was thinking we might be heading in the future.
Right, and I guess that has there been with the long debate in relation to renewable energy over perhaps the last 20 years in Australia, has there been some sort of policy gap in relation to that? Are we behind the 8 ball in relation to capacity, that capacity market and where things are going, or is there still time, I guess, or is it going to be a long delay for that sort of policy to change and to be introduced?
I think that's a really good question, and probably one of the main drivers of change that we're seeing at the moment is, as you mentioned before, all these new types of generation, the renewable generation, solar and wind, for example. You can't guarantee they'll be there all the time. At night, on a still night, there won't be any renewable energy unless there's quite significant storage co-located with those facilities. And I think perhaps the capacity market was considered to be a model that might incorporate these unstable sources of generation a little bit more. Under that capacity market, the idea was that retailers would pay generators separately to ensure that they had sufficient capacity or generation to meet their customers' demand. One of the criticisms, though, of the ESB's proposal to go towards a capacity market was that it will prop up fossil fuel generators when they might become unviable, or that it would be inconsistent with the new direction we're going in, which is to try and reduce fossil fuels and carbon emissions.
And that's been the debate, I guess, for many years now, isn't it? There's sort of the sector who have often raised the concerns around transitioning from older style generation, be it coal or gas, and moving too quickly, if we move too quickly to renewables and don't have those underlying sort of baseload generators, that we're going to have brownouts and we're going to see increased costs and power, and that sort of that's been a regular debate. But I mean, how do you see this playing out with the Energy Security Board and what they're doing?
It's interesting because I think they themselves recognise that their proposal was probably a little bit deficient in some areas, and so they coupled the capacity market idea with what's called a congestion management model. And under that model, it was a little bit more like gas pipeline capacity idea, where generators would be rewarded for submitting a bid if they were in a renewable energy zone. And we know that each of the states in the NEM has created these zones where there are good renewable energy resources and transmission capacity. And those generators would be penalised if they submitted a bid outside the renewable energy zone, and they would also be penalised if they contributed to a constraint on the network. So in this way, this new congestion management model almost ascribed a value to alleviating a constraint, a bit like a financial trading right, which exists in some other markets. But I think I think the ESB has decided, and a lot of the criticisms of the ESB's model means that there might not be enough behind it now to see it through.
Yeah, right. Because, I mean, a good portion of overseas energy markets do use a capacity mechanism, and of some kind. And look, I know you've worked in the US and been involved in a number of aspects of, changing those markets over there. But are there any aspects of perhaps the US market that would be worth looking at or considering in the Australian context of what we're going through at the moment?
Yeah, I think there are. And in fact, we had one of the senior executives from the PJM market, that's the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland market, who was running AEMO until recently. And I think she introduced quite a lot of this idea here. And in the PJM market, which was a true capacity market, there was a value ascribed to putting more generation into the system or reducing the amount of demand from the system. And what we saw over there were investment banks were going around and retrofitting whole communities so that their homes and businesses would automatically reduce their reliance on power. Simple things like light bulbs and so forth, to allow them to reduce their power consumption. And the investment banks would aggregate all that so that in effect it was the same as a generator putting more power into the system. The reward for those customers was that they would have lower power bills, and the investment bank would then bid that lower demand into the PJM market and would be rewarded financially for doing so. So that was a really interesting way of capitalising on this capacity mechanism that existed in the PJM.
So it's really dealing from demand and both sides of the energy equation, I guess, getting dealt with there.
Yeah.
Now, in Australia, obviously, we've got the ESB. They had their capacity mechanism. I think we assisted clients in putting submissions in and various other things along those lines. There was a lot of talk about it. But what's happened to that proposal, the ESB proposal?
It's very interesting, Stu. It's actually been gazumped, I would call it, by the energy ministers. And they got together at the end of last year and decided that, I think based on a lot of the criticism around the idea that perhaps the capacity market mechanism might prop up fossil fuels, they decided that they would not implement that true capacity market, and instead they're going to implement what's called a capacity investment scheme. And under that scheme, the government will run auctions of dispatchable renewable energy. Now that means energy that's ready to go into the system. So despite the fact that they might be renewable energy sources, it's going to probably promote a lot of storage development, which is what's needed. And under that system, if the project, if there's a shortfall in revenue, the government will guarantee that gap and pay the proponent of that project the gap. And if there's if they exceed the revenue that they are expecting, the government will share in the upside of that. And I think this new idea is what's coming. We have no idea what the detail is yet, but that's what's on the table at the moment.
Oh wow! And look, it does seem that that's pretty consistent, I guess, with a lot of the work that's being done with these renewable energy zones in each of the states, so certainly the East Coast states and WA, in relation to obviously WA's own market, but the East Coast states with their renewable energy zones, particularly states like New South Wales, who's doing a lot on building those renewable energy zones up. And with the electricity infrastructure roadmap, likewise in Queensland and Victoria, there's obviously a lot going on in those markets in relation to building transmission and centralising that transmission, so that there's a good bunch of projects within those particular areas. So there's still details, I guess, to be worked out in relation to this new Energy Security Board mechanism, the CIS?
Yes, I think there are. I mean, we don't really know what the details are yet, and I think until we see those details, it's probably a little bit early to say what exactly it's going to look like. But I do think you're right in that it will unlock the renewable energy zones. I think it'll attract investment, and I think, you know, that this is exactly what we need to move the NAM in particular towards the renewable energy targets that have now been set.
No, that's it. It's there is a huge. I mean, I think there's a huge amount of additional capacity that's going to be needed. We've got figures from AEMO on the reliability shortfall, and I think they're quite staggering in relation to those sort of shortfall numbers. You're looking at what, 7.3 gigawatts committed. You got 3.4 anticipated, and still a 45 gigawatts of additional.
Gigawatts, that's a lot.
It's a lot of projects. Yeah. So certainly, I think we've got a lot of opportunities for a lot of clients and developers in the next few years in relation to these projects. There's obviously a lot of work to do too to connect those projects. So in the renewable energy zones. So. I guess that's, as part of that, I guess moving forward, what do you see the future of the sort of energy market and the ECB in the coming years with this new development?
Yeah, I think the ESB is certainly still there, putting out more ideas and more proposals. And I think you're right, our clients will really benefit a lot from this new model that's being discussed. And hopefully the result of this will be a lot more renewable energy, a lot more storage, hopefully co-located, maybe pumped hydro, and we'll see the Marinus link open to bring us hydro from Tasmania a lot more. The Snowy project, of course, might also bolster that storage that we have, as well as battery projects. And I also think, new technologies are coming online so quickly that hopefully there will be breakthroughs that are more economic for our clients to invest in and be the solution to some of these issues that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, and probably one of those things is going to be with that 45 gigawatts, you're going to have this transmission constraints. Obviously that's going to be a major issue, especially on let's say on a sunny day or a windy day. In particular, res zones is going to be sort of like a lot of people wanting to get on and sell their energy. Going back to your time, I guess, in the US, what was the US approach to sort of managing queues and transmission constraints in that way?
Yeah, these queues of renewable energy projects lining up to connect to the grid is apparently a worldwide problem.
Yeah.
And in the States, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has recently passed an order that allows each of the independent system operators to allow proponents of these renewable energy projects to jump the queue and go to the top of the line, which is going to be, it's going to open up their access significantly. And the way that happens is that they're doing what's called cluster studies. And under each cluster study, which are focused on a zone in the United States, all the proponents in that zone are assessed together. They each have to do their own capability study to demonstrate that they will not, by connecting to the grid, they will not disrupt the technology or the technical aspects of the grid and the voltage fluctuations and all those sorts of aspects, as well as demonstrate very sound financial capability. If they're able to do that, then they go into the cluster study, and then the independent system operator will assess which of them will unlock constraints more, and if they pass all those hurdles, they go to the top of the queue and their proposal will be connected first. And I think that's going to have a huge impact all over the world if things like that are done to allow those more viable projects to connect first.
Yeah, no, look, and I think that is very consistent, I guess, with what we're proposing. That sort of system would work well in what we're proposing here in those, again, those renewable energy zones. If you've got those clusters, they're not dissimilar to a renewable energy zone. So that, and again, the co-location of perhaps behind the meter battery storage or pumped hydro or other things, so that you can really make the most of the, dispatchable power and readily available power for system security as well. So that it's an interesting idea of clusters and putting the ranking projects in order of priority.
It seems to be working in the States, and so I think it's probably worthy of consideration here. I'm not sure anyone has looked at it, but I think those overseas models can sometimes be helpful.
No, I agree. Well, thank you so much, Susan. It's been a really interesting discussion. As I say, I still can't believe the National Electricity Code's back from 1996. It's making me think it's been some time. But look, it's been a really great discussion. Thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope everyone got a bit of a better understanding about the national electricity market and things that are changing.